Okay, as far as big news in relation to the gaming world is concerned, this is something that has been trending as of late, and this is something that I find quite interesting, especially considering the fact that the Nintendo PlayStation prototype console is one that is very old. It's one that was never officially released. It was basically a game system that was going to be released by Sony Nintendo. I believe it would have been back in 1994, and we don't know what the price would have been if it were released. And we don't know, too many details about, what kind of, I guess, games would have been on it. I mean, it looked like, SNES games would have been playable on it, but there was also a CD drive. So I guess there would have been some type of, CD-ROM media in terms of like, games similar to what we got for the PS1. But, this console was never released because Sony and Nintendo had a fallout. And then, Sony decided to come out with their own game system, the PS1. Nintendo decided to go with the N64, which utilized cartridges instead of CD-ROMs. And, the rest is history. And basically, Sony seemed like they've had the upper hand, since the mid 90s in the console wars. But then in the 2000s, it seemed like Nintendo kind of got the upper hand to some extent because Nintendo DS was really successful. And I believe the Nintendo Wii was really successful as well. But the PlayStation 2, which came out back in the year 2000, released by Sony during the latter part of that year, ended up being the best selling game console of all time, I believe. So a lot of people, wonder how different, the landscape of the gaming industry would have been if the Nintendo PlayStation console was actually released back in the mid 90s. I don't think, Sony would be competing with Nintendo and vice versa. It definitely would have been worse news for Sega, who was competing against both Nintendo and Sony, and even, I believe, SNK, which had a Neo Geo, and they seemed like they were a blimp on the radar as far as, being a reasonable threat is concerned. So I don't know. It would have been really interesting to see how this would have went if Sony and Nintendo didn't have their fallout. However, it turns out the Nintendo PlayStation prototype console, which was never released, is valued over $200,000, which is very interesting. But at the same time, it's not too surprising, especially considering the fact that hardly anybody around the world has ever played it. Probably, maybe a handful of people have tried it out and have tested it, and based on its value and how long it's been out and all that stuff, I definitely think it's something that is worth having, especially if you're a huge like collector or just a huge hardcore fan of gaming in general. But at the same time, it's like a lot of people really can't afford $200,000, and that's quite a bit of money. And as far as like this console is concerned, I mean, some might argue it's even worth more than that because let's face it, you can't find a console like Nintendo PlayStation, prototype in used game stores at all. Okay, because I don't think I've ever been to a used game store and seen this console ever because this was never officially released. So as far as this being valued at the price that's currently at, I think it's reasonable. It's probably worth more than that, but if you could play like actual games on it, probably like SNES games and stuff like that, then yes, I can understand it being at that price because you look at a couple of screenshots or pictures of the console. Obviously, this console, I mean, it looked like it's compatible with SNES controllers, unless those controllers are custom made for that particular console. We really don't know, but that particular console looked like something that people would pay good money to get just to just for collector's purpose. Um, as far as whether or not this console would have been successful in the 90s following its release, I mean, who knows? I mean, I believe in the early 90s or by the time we got to the mid 90s, I believe Nintendo had the upper hand over Sega in the console wars because as popular as the Sega Genesis was, Super Nintendo was slightly more popular. That's where damn near all the RPGs were at. That's where you had all those Mario games, which were really successful. You had Super Mario All Stars. You had Super Mario World, which I believe was one of the best-selling games on that console. If not the best-selling game on the SNES console. And then I believe Sega had Sonic, the Sonic, the three Sonic games, the trilogy, which were all huge attractions on that particular console. But if Sony had joined forces with Nintendo during the mid '90s, it's quite possible that Sega could have folded a lot sooner than they did because Sega, was barely holding its own against Nintendo up until I guess the late '90s when we got the Sega Dreamcast. And for some reason, that particular console was well, basically, it got blown out of the water by the PS1, and not only that, I believe the N64 was managed to surpass the Sega Dreamcast in sales as well. I believe the Sega Dreamcast was not too far off from the Nintendo Wii U as far as sales is concerned. So I don't know. I mean, like if the Nintendo-PlayStation consoles officially ever came out, if it was officially released back in the '90s, the entire landscape of gaming as we know it today could have been completely different.